Perfect. Thank you very much. And we are going to be reading a chapter from the book of Ruth today, but it's not the first chapter. So I do want to go ahead and give a little bit of a prequel. I don't know, that's probably not the right. A little bit of an introduction on what happens in the first chapter before we read this second chapter. So I'm just going to set this up. So there is a woman named Naomi, and her husband and her 2 sons, they are wanting to get away from a famine. So they travel to the land of Moab. And while they're living in Moab, they're there for about 10 years. And while they're there, both of Naomi's sons get married. But then both Abimelech, who is Naomi's husband, and both of Naomi's sons die. And so she is there, and she's left with her 2 daughters-in-law. And these 3 women decide, what are we going to do? And Naomi says, I'm going to return to Israel. And she decides she's going to send her 2 young daughters-in-law back to their birth families. And Orpah, which is one of the daughters-in-law, reluctantly agrees, and she leaves and heads back to her family of origin. But Ruth, her other daughter-in-law, chooses to stay with Naomi. So, and she declares to Naomi that your people will be my people, your land will be my land, and your God will be my God. So both Naomi and Ruth, they move back to Israel. They move back to Naomi's home where she had grown up and had been there 10 years previously. But while they're there, they have nobody to take care of them this time. There's no husbands or men who are able to earn an income and take care of them, so they find themselves in poverty. And Ruth goes about trying to collect food so they can survive. And this is where we find ourselves in Ruth chapter 2, which I'm going to go ahead and read for us. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. Sometimes it's Abimelech, it's both. One day Ruth the Moabite, and said to Naomi, let me go out into harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. And Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law Elimelech. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, he said. The Lord bless you, the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? And the foreman replied, she is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes' rest in the shelter. Boaz went over and said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water that has been drawn from the well. Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What have I done to deserve such kindness? She asked. I'm only a foreigner. Yes, I know, Boaz replied, but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done. I hope I continue to please you, sir, she replied. You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers. At mealtime, Boaz called to her, come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine. So she sat with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all that she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time. So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that she had left over from her meal. Where did you gather all this grain today? Naomi asked. Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you. So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man whose field she had worked. She said, "The man I worked with today is named Boaz. May the Lord bless him," Naomi told her daughter-in-law. "He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers." Then Ruth said, "What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and to stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed." "Good," Naomi exclaimed. "Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you'll be safe with him." So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's fields and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the whole wheat harvest in early summer, and all the while she lived with her mother-in-law. For those of you who might be familiar with story, you know what comes next. But if you don't know, I'm just going to go ahead and share that after this introduction that happens where Boaz meets Ruth and she finds about this, after this we go into chapter 3, where Ruth goes and does this incredibly kind gesture, incredibly bold gesture of kind of making the first move with Boaz. And she goes and she chooses and lets him know that she is available to be married to him. And Boaz then, in response to this, goes through all of the proper social customs, all of the legal necessities in order so that he can redeem Ruth and be able to marry her in a proper way. And he does, and when they are married, they then have the son whose name is Obed, and Obed is the grandfather to King who becomes King David. So this is the story of Ruth. And for those of you who know it, might be very familiar with it, it is a very popular story that we talk a lot about in church because it's just a good story. It's such a good story. But it teaches us many things, and I've heard so many wonderful sermons and sermon series about the story. Stories about God's provision, stories about what it's like to live in a time of famine, stories about what it's like to be redeemed, stories about the lasting legacy of God's goodness in a family. And among all of those things, there's also this story that I want to talk about this morning, which is how it shows us about kindness. And as I was putting together my notes and my questions that I actually had created questions in case there was youth here today. As I was putting all those together, I realized I probably could have actually broken this up into an entire series because there is a lot in this story about kindness. So this morning, I don't want to do all of what could have been in a whole series. I just want to share a few highlights about things that I found meaningful when reading this story. The first is that kindness happens in community. Kindness actually doesn't happen in isolation. You can't stay away from people and kind of cut people out of your life and then expect kindness to thrive. It actually doesn't work that way. It happens when it's in relationship with others. Ruth could not have displayed kindness if she had not been with Naomi in the first place and then chosen to stay with Naomi. Boaz could not have displayed any kind of kindness even to Ruth, if he had not already been in and amongst in a relationship with his workers, close workers. He went out and he got to know Ruth. And then it grew, the kindness grew in that connection and that relationship and those interactions until he was able to marry her. And he did so in a very kind way, and the kindness continued to thrive. Ruth could not have shown kindness to Boaz, which if you do go on and you read this and you see in chapter 3, he very much praises her for her kindness in choosing him instead of chasing after someone else. If she had stayed away from him, if she had kind of kept him at arm's distance, if she had done that, she wouldn't have been able to have this kind of kindness show up in her interactions with him. In this story, we also see this idea of kindness that is displayed to strangers. There's this conversation and all this that happens in chapter 2 about gleaning, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But basically, it is an act of charity that leads to kindness even to strangers, people that are not known. But it is still very much in community. There still is required to be this interaction. And I want to talk a little bit about that gleaning for just a second, because this is a law that was actually established by God. He required it to be that when people were going out and working the harvest, that first of all, they were specifically to leave anything on the edges. anything that was kind of near the edge of the fields, they were required to leave it and not harvest that part. They also were required, as they were going about and they were harvesting, anything that they dropped or fell from their hands, their carts, their baskets, they were not allowed to pick it up. Which we kind of go, well, that seems very inefficient. But this was God orchestrating this purposefully so that there would be this extra piece that is left behind for anyone who is in need could go and collect it. And so this act of gleaning was a very important part to the community of Israel. All those who were struggling and suffering were able to go out and collect food because there was food specifically meant to be left in the field for those people. And that included not just people who were in the community who were struggling, but it included newcomers, foreigners, strangers, that they were able to be included in this community process of gleaning from the fields. So Boaz practiced this. He was good at understanding this, and he incorporated it as a part of what he was doing. And Boaz's charity to allow people to glean in his fields leads to this kindness and this interaction with Ruth. And it's kindness to someone he had not met yet, but it grows in his community. In this example of the story, we see of kindness in so many different forms. But the majority of the kindness is to those who are in close relationship, close community. Ruth's kindness to Naomi was one that took place in her own home, in her own family. It was one of the biggest acts of faithfulness and kindness that we do see in this story. And I think that is an important thing for us to pay attention to, because often when we think about kindness, we don't care about what type of relationship it happens. In fact, a lot of times we emphasize kindness to strangers, but we don't necessarily pay attention to the kindness of those that we are closest to. That's not to say that we shouldn't be charitable or we shouldn't be polite, but it is a very different thing than what we're talking about now. There's things that we talk about being the epitome of kindness, like sending money to charity, or leaving a loonie in the cart at the store, or paying for the car behind you in the drive-thru. And these are all lovely things. There's nothing wrong with doing these things. But if this is the bulk of what we see of being kindness, then we're really missing a lot. If we think this is the greatest acts of kindness that we can do, then we are missing on so much of what God actually wants for us in our lives. Because kindness is the most pronounced when it is with those that we are in the closest relationships to, those people that we interact with the most. And this is a scary thing because it comes with risk. And we see that for both Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, that all of their acts of kindness with those that they were closest to them, every single one of those was also a great risk that they took in being kind to them. But the beautiful act of this is that risk is also, it's not just risk, but it is also the ability to have this be mutually back and forth. In community and relationship with each other, this is where we see the majority of kindness showing up. And in this relationship, we also see this dynamic of it is not unidirectional, meaning it doesn't just go one way. It is both kindness from those who have more and are kind of above, you could say, the top down, but kindness also goes the other direction in this story. I think sometimes we get in the idea of that kindness is that only when we extend to those who are less than or have less than. There's somebody who needs something from me and I give to them, then that is an act of kindness. But there is also this ability to be kind to those who you are in need from. Those that you see as above you, whether they have more or you just, for whatever reason, see them as being above you. There is this act of kindness that goes the other direction. And I think this story really exemplifies that act. We see that the kindness is mutual. Boaz is kind to Ruth in that he allows her to be there. He offers protection. He offers her more than what she's entitled to. He is being incredibly kind to her. But Ruth is being kind to Boaz as well. Even in how she acts, her gratitude, her diligence, the way that she works with the other gleaners in the field, there is a two-way direction with this kindness that happens. there is this thing that happens, and even the fact that this starts with God himself in creating the provision of gleaning in the first place, that it works down. But then it is meant to go back. It's meant to be this act of how it returns to people. And I love this. I find it encouraging because this is where sometimes we allow ourselves to be kind to others because we see it as an act of almost authority or asserting that we're better. But the truth is that we need kindness from others too. And we need to accept it when people are being kind to us, because it is not about a strategy of who is above and who is below, but it is this mutual, multi-directional experience that we have in community. That kindness is meant to go both ways, and we should indulge in it in both ways. We should be figuring out ways to have kindness show up in our relationships with all the people that we interact with. So even though when these statutes are being carried out, God, well, that's a whole other conversation. We're not going to do that right now. But God has this provision that he creates for the Israelites where there is this act of gleaning that they do, but the act of gleaning is not the kindness. It is the opportunity for kindness to show up. It is a statute that is given in order to encourage people to be charitable. But as we see from the story, there were other fields where it may not have been a kind interaction. And so there's this idea that sometimes we get caught up in the concept that the action itself is where we find if it's kind or not. But the gleaning in the field is not what constituted kindness. What constituted kindness is both in how those who were partaking in the gleaning were acting and how those who were allowing the gleaning to happen. That's where the kindness was found and how it was being carried out. So this is the last part that I want to talk about just in what we see in the story. That sometimes we think of kindness as being something that actually would be better described as politeness or niceties. Smiling at somebody, making sure we use nice words. I remember when our kids were little, the phrase using a kind face was a really big deal. That was like all the families were saying, use a kind face, use kind words. And it's not that this is not true, but what we're talking about really more is politeness and niceties. It's not bad for us to use politeness and niceties. Those are good things and great things for us to teach our children. But I don't think that's what God had in mind when he talks about kindness. Instead, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this is more like what we think about when we think of the fruit of the Spirit. And one of the fruit of the Spirit is kindness. And like that idea, the fruit is not the thing we do. It is the result. It is the byproduct. It is based on how we allow God to show up to work out those things in our lives. And we've talked about this with joy. We don't go out and do joy. We do things to allow God's presence in our lives to have joy grow and thrive in our lives. And it's going to be the same thing with kindness. And if our understanding of kindness is just that we do polite things and we make sure that our face has a kind look on it, I think we're missing out on this fruit of the Spirit where God wants this thing thriving in our lives. And I think the book of Ruth, the entire book of Ruth, is a great resource as explaining the difference and the depth of what that kind of kindness looks like. Because kindness was not found in the type of actions that Ruth and Boaz did. Boaz allowing people to glean from his fields is not where the kindness show up. How Boaz chose people, chose to care about the people, how he chose for them to thrive in that space, how he gave them more than even he was asked to give. In doing that, kindness showed up. This kind of ties back to that first point I made, that kindness thrives in community. It's not the actions, it's the relationships where kindness takes hold and roots and begins to fruit. Kindness happens in community, and kindness happens when we choose people that we are in community with. In the passage this morning, the whole book of Ruth, the kindness of Ruth was not in her choosing to follow her mother-in-law, it was in her choosing her mother-in-law. Ruth chose to stay with her mother-in-law, and in that choice, kindness flourished from all of the interactions that they had. When they got to Israel, Ruth went out and she said, I'm going to go glean from the fields, not because gleaning from the fields is a kind thing to do, but I want us to thrive. I want my mother-in-law to be fed and cared for, and this is what I'm going to do, is I'm going to care for her. And so kindness shows up in that space. And then she listens to Naomi, and Naomi gives her instructions. In the chapter 3, she gives her instructions on how she interacts with Boaz in order to lead to this opportunity for marriage and redemption for their entire family. And in those moments of her caring for Naomi, in those moments of her caring and listening to Naomi, in her moments of how she interacted and how she cared for Boaz, this kindness flourished into a whole new family and relationship. Because kindness is not the types of things that we do. Kindness is what happens when we choose people, when we choose to care for people, when we choose to take that risk in knowing that it might not be returned. And kindness is what happens then when there's that reciprocal back. Boaz chooses to protect and to provide for Ruth, not because it's the nice thing to do, not because it's the kind thing to do, but because he chooses Ruth. He chooses to go out of his way and to take care of her in a way that redeems her and lifts her up to the point that she is mentioned throughout the New Testament as well. She is now she's the great-grandmother of the future king. I think this is a wonderful picture, a wonderful story for us to chew on, for us to pay attention to what this kind of kindness looks like. It's wonderful when we do things like smile at someone or cook a meal for someone, or we offer a hug or a word of encouragement. But that's the very minimum. Kindness is so much more than that, because kindness is what happens when we choose a person. And that when we're in a relationship with that person, we choose to care for them in a way that we want to see them thrive and flourish. And in that process of picking them and taking care of them, kindness starts to thrive. It starts to grow. It starts to bear fruit in our lives. Kindness is something more than just offering to do a nice thing, like bring somebody a cup of coffee, but kindness is that when you invest in someone and someone invests back in you. That's the kind of kindness we see in the life of Ruth, in the story of Ruth, and that's the kind of kindness that God encourages for us to seek as well. And I find that so encouraging this morning. Not only that God understands and creates something with such depth and life-giving ability for us, but the fact that he himself lives that out in his life with us. His kindness for us is where we can thrive, where we are found to be cared for in a way that fulfills us and sustains us, and that our act of wanting to have that kind of kindness in our relationship with each other leads to a thriving community. Let's go ahead and pray. God, I thank you that you are the God who knows these things, who has given us the gift of these things, and that you have given us the ability to go deeper and so much more fullness, so much more completeness with this idea of kindness than sometimes what we limit it to. God, we pray that over the course of this week that we chew on this thought, that we consider this thought a little bit, that we consider ways that we can deepen into our community, that we can allow there to be space for kindness to thrive and to fruit in our relationships with each other and all of our interactions, that we allow ourselves to be willing to accept kindness from others and not always feel like somehow we just can only have it go one way, and we're always seeking to have it just go one way. God, we pray that we find ways to allow you to show up in our lives so that kindness is thriving. That kindness is thriving not just in our own minds and our own hearts, but kindness is thriving in all of our relationships. That others, when they see that, they see the kind of love reflected in those relationships that is the same kind of love you give to us. That's about compassion and caring, investing in other people in a way that brings about goodness and a legacy of love. God, this is our prayer this morning. In your name, amen. Is it okay if you stop the recording, Corey?